In his 20s and 30s, Phineas Taylor Barnum was an enslaver, an exploiter, an alcoholic, cruel to both his family and colleagues, and ridiculously impulsive with his business decisions. But by the end of his life, he was an abolitionist, entirely sober, a family man, and an advertising genius. He was one of America's first millionaires, and clearly one of our most polarizing figures. Born in 1810 in Bethel, Connecticut, he lived all the way until 1891, watching this country transform from puritanical post-Revolutionary War through the bloody Civil War, all the way into the Industrial Revolution. He grew up in a strict religious town where public lashings and imprisonment for debt were commonplace, and he married a deeply religious woman named Charity Hallett at the ripe age of 19 years old. She would be his companion for the next 44 years and bear him 4 daughters: Caroline, Helen, Frances, and Pauline, though Frances died shortly before her 2nd birthday. He first made some money in the lottery business before it became illegal in Connecticut in 1834, and he used that money to open a newspaper. But libel laws were very strict back then, and he actually spent 2 months in jail for writing that a local church elder named Seth Seeley was guilty of taking usury of an orphan boy. His trial was highly publicized and well known throughout the state, and he actually continued writing his paper from his jail cell. Upon his release, there was a huge town party, a private dinner, and a parade that carried him all the way back to his hometown. This is where he got his first taste of fame, and it stuck with him for life. From here, he went on to create these individual sideshow acts that we'd now call scams. The first scam that Barnum pulled was in 1835, when he purchased an enslaved black woman named Joyce Heth. Barnum advertised Joyce as being 161 years old and said that she had formerly been enslaved by George Washington himself. Even though his stunt drew huge crowds, it also attracted the attention of staunch abolitionists, and eventually he was outed as a liar, with Joyce being revealed to be no older than 80. Word of his dishonesty spread like wildfire, and he quickly became known as a humbug. But as people began to speculate that he was a liar, Barnum noticed that Joyce's popularity actually increased. This is one of the first times that Barnum realized he didn't really need to tell the full truth in what he coined show business. He only needed to provide entertainment. Joyce passed away the following year, and Barnum pulled several other stunts after her, all of which were half-truths or lies. In 1837, there was a major financial crash nationwide, and Barnum used the money he made off of these stunts to purchase the contents of several failing museums in New York City. This is how the original Barnum's Museum was born, on Broadway across from St. Paul's Church. Most Americans know Barnum for his big top traveling circus, but Barnum's real passion was always in the museum. And when I say museum, I don't mean like Smithsonian. Think more like Ripley's Believe It or Not. And in this museum, he had a floor with what he called living curiosities, people who had unique talents, features, or really anything outside of the norm. A lot of these living curiosities actually lived in the museum, along with Barnum and his entire family. In 1842, Barnum met a boy named Charles Stratton, and it was Charles who would make Barnum famous worldwide. Charles was a little person, and when Barnum met him, he was only 4 years old. Barnum gave Charles the stage name of General Tom Thumb and greatly exaggerated how small Charles was in the advertisements he posted in local papers and the posters he hung up throughout the city. Almost instantly, Charles was a huge draw to Barnum's museum. Now, for as much as Barnum absolutely exploited Charles, it is also worth pointing out that Charles had a natural talent for performing and comedy. Yes, Barnum made a 4-year-old child work full-time, and yes, that child was also extremely smart and talented. Charles consistently drew a huge crowd for Barnum, and 2 years later, an idea popped into his head: a European tour to take their act abroad, during which Queen Victoria becomes extremely fond of Charles. It is on this tour in Europe where Barnum becomes a household name, thanks to Charles's wit and charm. He's abroad for 3 years with Charles, missing the birth of his youngest daughter and the death of his second youngest. He returns to America a horrible alcoholic, but due to an embarrassing visit to the New York State Fair, his wife's pleas, and a speech by a minister named Edwin Chapin, that Barnum decides to quit drinking forever. He'd never touch another drop of alcohol in his life. It is through his sobriety, through traveling abroad and experiencing many different cultures, and through his fondness of gathering with other intellectuals, that Barnum's entire worldview begins to shift, and he changes his stance on slavery. But does this stop him from keeping 5 domestic servants? No. Does it stop him from exploiting people in his Living Curiosities exhibit? No. For over 5 decades, Barnum would use the same formula when he discovered a freak, many of whom were disabled, people of color, or both. He would rebrand and rename them, then create a completely outlandish story for them, ranging anywhere from cannibalism to feral children to warriors. He also turned a blind eye to the abuse and inhumane treatment of hundreds of exotic animals, with elephants, rhinos, and beluga whales being his favorite to display. He also detested indigenous Americans, and in 1863, he actually invited the Cheyenne and Kiowa leaders, Warbonnet, Lean Bear, Lone Wolf, and White Bull, along with 5 other indigenous people, to his museum, only to mock them in front of audiences in English, a language none of them spoke. And I swear the story of the killing of the buffalo is following me, because guess what? Barnum was invited by General Custer himself to participate in a buffalo hunt in 1870, where they killed 20 buffalo in a day. But don't worry, he and his buddies stopped after killing 20 because they didn't want to be guilty of wanton butchery. Even though Barnum was extremely successful, there is something that stopped him in his tracks not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. Fire. His beloved first museum on Broadway burned down on July 13th, 1865. In just 6 weeks, Barnum rebuilt a new museum. On March 3rd, 1968, that museum burnt down. His giant mansion that he named Iranistan burnt to the ground on December 17th, 1857. In 1872, he purchased a performance hall that seated 2,500 people, and before it could even open, it burned to the ground. And finally, the winter quarters for his circus in Bridgeport, Connecticut, one of the largest animal training grounds in the world at the time, burned down on November 20th, 1887. For good reason, Barnum started to become fascinated with a moving show rather than a permanent structure, something he'd already toyed with in his early career. He actually came out of retirement to enter into the business most Americans know him for, the traveling circus. I learned all of this in this Bible of a book, P.T. Barnum, America's Greatest Showman, which was written and compiled by 3 members and 2 generations of the same family, the Coonharts, Philip Jr., and Peter. After Barnum's Joyce Heth scam, but before he acquired his museum, he advertised a grand buffalo hunt, free of charge. And this buffalo hunt was to take place in Hoboken, New Jersey. Now please, I do know they're bison. I read history books, and historically bison are referred to as buffalo. What were buffalo doing in Hoboken, New Jersey? A man named Mr. Fitzhugh had them on display under a tent. But these buffalo were described to be docile, undersized, and scrawny. I have no idea where this Mr. Fitzhugh acquired these buffalo, but Barnum purchased all of them for $700. And in his advertisement for this grand buffalo hunt, Barnum portrayed these buffalo as dangerous beasts from the prairies of New Mexico. These were beaten and battered buffalo. These were not dangerous beasts. They were extremely defeated. And he said these beasts would be behind double-railed fencing so as to prevent anything happening to the public who came to see them. But it wasn't the danger that drew a crowd in. It was the word free. He was advertising this as a free event. Rather than charge the public to see the buffalo, Barnum contacted the ferry companies. And he said, if I get everyone across the river, I get half your proceeds. It'll be a very busy day, I promise. At the time, these ferries were charging 6 cents per person each way. So 12 cents a person. And he said to the ferry companies, I guarantee you 16,000 people are going to go. He underestimated this. 24,000 people crossed the river to see this show. But once everyone arrived at the show, it turned out to be a total joke. because he was a scam artist, a humbug, if you will. There was supposed to be an Indio lasso act, and it was a disaster. The skinny and frightened animals refused to cooperate, and this made the audience of thousands laugh, and the laughter caused the buffaloes to stampede. The buffalo broke through Barnum's flimsy railing and ran off into the New Jersey swamplands. It was a total joke, and lucky for Barnum, no one was hurt, even though the newspapers the next day greatly exaggerated things and said that people were killed. No one was killed. It was just another falsely advertised scheme. Barnum was anticipating making $1,000 off this scheme, but he actually made $3,400. He didn't care that it ended up being a joke. All he wanted was to flip the purchase of the buffalo, which cost him $700, and he made a $2,700 profit. Nothing is written about what happened to these buffaloes after they escaped. I hope they ran back to the prairie. Zoology was super new at the time, and Barnum went to great lengths to make sure these animals survived, but I wouldn't say he went to great lengths to make sure they were comfortable or happy. And to get all of his exotic animals, he used international dealers, which we kind of would now call poachers, and foreign consulships. So like an American living abroad who could keep their ear to the ground and listen for any unusual exotic animal stories, I guess. And in 1861, Barnum gets word that a group of Canadian fishermen have captured a white whale near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And Barnum lost it. He had to have this whale. He started to design this special train car that was lined with seaweed to transport this whale to America. And he had attendants with sponges funneling salt water into the whale's mouth and blowhole. But unfortunately, this is where his logic stopped, because he began prepping a tank in his basement. And this is prior to the period where it was common to have electricity in your home. So his basement was filled with gas lamps. He built a 40-foot by 18-foot brick and cement tank. And while this first whale was on its way to Barnum's museum, Barnum himself went to Canada to make sure he could get another one. He wanted two in this tank. And somehow he coordinated this. He did get two, almost on the same day in New York City. However, this is where I'm not sure what he was thinking, because he had the foresight to make sure there was salt water in the transportation, but he filled the basement tanks with fresh water, uncirculating fresh water at that. And because he was using gas lamps, it was super hot in his basement. It took less than 2 days for these poor whales to perish. But Barnum was still determined to have whales in his museum, so he bribed a local alderman for the right to pump salt water from the New York harbor directly into his museum. And then he built a $4,000, 24 square foot tank, this time on the museum's second floor. And this new tank had a base of slate and sides made of 1-inch thick glass that he had specially imported. Barnum successfully got 2 more whales, put those whales in the tank, and they raked in the dough for him. But still, after a short run, these 2 also perished. This time simply because the environment kind of depressed them. They just slowly died. But by December of 1861, he was trying again, and he got a 3rd pair of whales from off the coast of Labrador. And somehow, these 2 whales adapted to the museum environment. But on July 13th, 1865, Barnum's first museum caught fire at around noon. Out of the dozens of large animals he had, and hundreds of small animals, only a handful managed to escape. The largest animal to survive this fire was a seal named Ned, who was Barnum's most famous animal, and thankfully one of the museum staff members thought to release the birds. So all of the birds survived, and many of the snakes also escaped, but they escaped into a crowd of spectators watching the museum burn. And this crowd either trampled most of them or killed them with sticks. Barnum had a polar bear, lions, kangaroos, monkeys, a hippo, and of course the 2 beluga whales, all of which perished in this fire. And unfortunately, the exact same thing happened to all the new exotic animals he acquired at his second museum. Jumbo the elephant was captured in 1861 in an African jungle. It doesn't say which country, nobody really knows, but Jumbo was taken to Cairo and then sold to a zoo in Paris, and that zoo sold Jumbo to a zoo in London. And Jumbo grew to be the largest animal in captivity at the time, so he was in high demand. For 2 decades, the Royal Zoological Society in London had Jumbo giving rides to children day after day after day. Hundreds of thousands of children rode on Jumbo. Now, Barnum heard about Jumbo's size and wanted him since the moment he knew about him, and offered the Zoological Society $10,000. They repeatedly turned him down, but after 2 decades, Jumbo started to throw some uncharacteristic temper tantrums, as they called it. He was tired of having to be a horse for children every day. Out of fear that Jumbo's tantrums would grow worse, the zoo finally accepted Barnum's offer. And to grow the hype of bringing Jumbo to America, Barnum actually started rumors in London that Londoners were being tricked out of the Jumbo sale. Like, he started the rumor that he got Jumbo for a steal, and that London shouldn't be giving up Jumbo so easily. And it worked. By the thousands, Barnum started to get letters from London begging him to not go through with the Jumbo. And businesses in America were starting to make Jumbo souvenirs because he was already famous even before arriving. Barnum purposefully leaned into being the jerk of the scenario because it just made Jumbo even more famous. Like, oh, he's being sold against his will to this evil American man. We have to save Jumbo, save Jumbo. And Barnum absolutely capitalized off of this. Barnum moved forward with building a giant cage on a ship to carry Jumbo across the sea to America. But when Jumbo came aboard, he refused to get into the cage. And all of Barnum's workers wrote Barnum panicked, being like, what are we gonna do? He's refusing to cooperate. And Barnum said, let him refuse. Keep him on the boat, let him sit on his butt. It'll make the story even greater. Now Jumbo himself doesn't even want to go to America. And again, this tactic worked so well that Parliament and the Queen got involved. The Queen was practically begging Barnum to let Jumbo stay in London. And Barnum still said, no, a deal's a deal. Jumbo's coming to America. I bought him fair and square. Jumbo had a keeper since he was a baby named Matthew Scott, and Scott was Jumbo's best friend. Jumbo loved him. And to finally convince Jumbo to get in the cage, Matthew Scott said, why don't I come along? Because really, he didn't want to part with Jumbo either. That was also his best friend. When Matthew Scott got into the cage, Jumbo followed right along, and off to America they went. When Jumbo arrived on American soil, he was already a celebrity, and Jumbo paid for himself in his first 3 weeks of working for Barnum. He was bringing in $3,000 a day. Once in America, Jumbo never threw a temper tantrum ever again. He really enjoyed the circus rather than parading children around all day. But Barnum had an official taxidermist named Henry A. Ward, and in 1883, Ward requested that upon Jumbo's death, because Jumbo was the most famous animal worldwide at this point, upon Jumbo's death, Ward wanted to be the one to stuff him. And Barnum said, God forbid he die, but absolutely I'd have no one else do it except for you. Another reason Jumbo was really enjoying himself in America was because Barnum had about 30 other elephants. He finally had other friends besides Matthew Scott. But on the night of September 15th, 1885 in St. Thomas, Ontario, Keeper Scott was leading Jumbo and another small elephant named after Tom Thumb into their cages on trains after the show. And before he saw anything strange, Keeper Scott heard a train whistle, and he knew there were no trains scheduled for now. It was an unscheduled unscheduled train, and it struck Jumbo and crushed Jumbo's skull in over 100 places, but did not kill him instantly. Scott comforted his best friend as he slowly died, and once Jumbo passed, Scott was so overwhelmed with grief that he essentially passed out into a deep sleep, and nobody could wake him for several hours. The smaller elephant of the accident was not killed, he only broke his leg. Barnum was notified immediately of the tragedy and instantly wrote to Henry A. Ward, the taxidermist. It took Ward 2 days to get to Jumbo, and once he was on the scene, he notified Barnum that he could make 2 versions of Jumbo. A version of Jumbo with just his skin, and extracting Jumbo's skeleton alongside. Barnum said, "Do it," and by April 1886, 2 versions of Jumbo were on display. And Barnum had his other elephants trained in like a funeral procession type show, where they were draped in black and trained to like pat their eyes with a tissue because they were crying. This is one of 3 places in the book where I sobbed. Poor Jumbo should have been in an African jungle living his life, and instead he was hit by a train in Ontario. Barnum did offer people with disabilities and other deformities unique opportunities at the time. He also did pay relatively well for the time and oftentimes also housed their families. And in both his museum and circus, oftentimes performers would find a found family. It was not a good time to be a disabled person, and this put them in an environment where people were looking out for them and cared for them, and people who really loved them. And I want to highlight specifically the people he was exploiting with intellectual disabilities. So as I've discussed, Barnum did not have a linear business history because of fires and bankruptcy. So several times, more than 5, probably closer to 10 times in his career, he had to drop everyone on his payroll. So oftentimes his performers without intellectual disabilities were able to carry on, find new housing, and find new work. However, the people with intellectual disabilities that he was exploiting, particularly those with microcephaly, which were some of his favorites to display and employ, they'd be completely abandoned when something like this happened. He did not provide housing for them or accommodations for them after these catastrophes. Like, for example, the 2 people he hired with microcephaly, Maximo and Bartola, who he gave the stage names the Aztec Children. Now, nobody really knows where they were from. The best guess is that they were the children of peasants from San Salvador, but he marketed them as the last Aztec children, and they were rather small in stature and had a severe intellectual disability. He was paying and housing Maximo and Bartola, but he also staged a fake marriage between them for a crowd to see, even though they're brother and sister. And it was advertised that they were brother and sister, but he also said that the Aztecs were okay with marriages between siblings. I have no idea if that's true or not. I have not done research on Aztec culture, but regardless, they have an intellectual disability, so that's extreme exploitation that he absolutely profited on. Even worse, years later on an official government tour, General Henry S. Taylor said that he discovered Maximo and Bartola in an insane asylum. He recognized them from Barnum's show and said, "Wait a minute, what are you 2 doing here?" The asylum workers apparently told him that Barnum actually got Maximo and Bartola from them in the first place. So that is where Barnum allegedly found them, and once they were no longer making money for him, Barnum allegedly returned them. So again, yes, more than one thing can be true. Barnum did provide unique opportunities for disabled folks at the time. He did pay them. They did enjoy performing. However, once they were no longer making him any money, they were tossed aside like a sack of potatoes. Now, I tried to find the General Henry S. Taylor that this book is referring to. I think they might have meant Sir Henry Taylor, because Sir Henry Taylor was head of the West Indian Department at the Colonial Office in 1861, and he did do quite a bit of research on asylums and the treatment of patients in said asylums. But anyway, as I said in my first video, Barnum was a polarizing figure. You can find both good and horrible facts throughout his career. Let's talk about 2 people Barnum couldn't rip off because by the time he met them, they were already super famous and successful. Chang and Eng Bunker. Chang and Eng were born in 1811 in Bangkok, Thailand, which was then known as Siam. This is where the derogatory term for conjoined twins comes from. Chang and Eng were conjoined at the stomach, and their parents actually fought doctors in order to keep them as conjoined twins. They didn't trust the doctor's methods at the time, which I don't blame them, it was 1811, but unfortunately their father passed when they were only 8 years old, and this gave them no choice but to help their mother earn a living. They began selling coconut oil and duck eggs to any big ship that would dock in Bangkok, and people began to take notice at how adept they were at rowing their boat together. They became so famous that the King of Siam himself visited them, and in 1829, an American boat captain noticed them. On the spot, this boat captain offered them a job in Europe, and from there it didn't take them long to end up in America. And for the next 7 years, they became extremely famous. At the beginning of the video, I called them Chang and Eng Bunker. This is a last name they adopted in America to fit in better, and so that their citizenship papers looked more American. But in 1838, they became exhausted of exhibiting themselves, plus they had been working full-time since they were 8 years old. Some of the richest Asian Americans in the 19th century, Chang and Eng decided to retire. But here is where the story really took me by surprise. To retire, the Bunker twins purchased a plantation in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They became enslavers, purchasing 33 humans over time. So despite knowing what it was like to stick out like a sore thumb in America, Chang and Eng still purchased and enslaved Black Americans. They married a set of sisters named Sarah and Adelaide Yates. Chang and Adelaide had 10 children, and Eng and Sarah had 12. And actually, in their retirement, the two twins really grew to not like one another. Now, all of what I just talked about happened before they even agreed to work for Barnum. They were refusing him for years, decades even. Barnum even had a wax figure made of them to put into his museum. And in 1853, he started selling these weird little booklets about their life, which implied that he had a business deal with them, but he absolutely didn't. But in 1860, their 22 children caught up with them, and they finally caved to Barnum's advances because they needed to pay for all of their children's college educations. But they said to Barnum, "We're only doing 6 weeks, no more." And Barnum said, "Hey, I'm gonna take what I could get. Come on over." And during their partnership, Barnum really disliked the twins. And it's because they were super sharp and he could not control them. It also didn't help that not only did Chang and Eng not like each other, but Sarah and Adelaide also didn't like each other. Barnum wrote that both sets of siblings fought like cats and dogs. Chang was a heavy drinker and Eng didn't drink at all. And Barnum even wrote that one day his employees heard Chang and Eng fighting in their room. So his employees burst in and saw Chang on top of Eng, strangling him. Despite all of the problems, Barnum offered them a longer contract past their 6 weeks, and Chang and Eng had enough. Instead, they decided to do their own tour, in which they would sail from California to Thailand, which they had not been back to in 30 years. But this plan was scrapped by the outbreak of the Civil War. The Civil War stripped them of their wealth entirely, and by the end of it, they did not have a penny to their name. They went on to live until 1874, when Chang suffered a stroke, and this caused Eng to die on the very same day, just 4 hours later. I did not know our current president idolized Barnum as a child, but I drew some parallels between them while I was reading this book, so it's interesting to learn this. For example, Barnum had a super popular autobiography that he had written, and in 1858 he added on an address to it called The Art of Money Getting. Whose book title does that sound like? In his early adult life, Barnum was an alcoholic, and later in his life, he was one of the main leaders of the temperance movement. Who else do we know who doesn't drink at all? Barnum was also somebody who didn't care if he was telling the full truth as long as he profited off of it. And in 1888, at the age of 78, Barnum wanted to run for president. He wanted to go up against Grover Cleveland, and he went so far as to choose himself a running mate. But the Republican Party fell behind Benjamin Harrison instead, and he went on to win the presidency. Now remember, back then, the Republican Party was the less conservative party. One thing that really did surprise me about Barnum, though, is that he did not cheat on Charity. At least there are no records of it. There's no proof that he ever did. That is to say, physically cheat on Charity. Because he absolutely did emotionally cheat on her with a woman named Nancy Fish. Barnum had a friend in England named John Fish who had 2 daughters, Jane Ann and Nancy. And in 1870, Barnum invited John Fish to America, and John brought his daughter, Jane Ann. Barnum gave John and Jane Ann a grand tour of America that also included Cuba, and during this tour, John Fish was writing back home to his other 19-year-old daughter, Nancy. And for some reason, John Fish allowed Barnum to read the letters that Nancy was writing to him. Apparently, her letters were so moving that Barnum began to write her, having never seen her or met her before. John Fish and Jane Ann eventually went back home to England, but in 1872, Barnum invited John Fish and his daughter Nancy back to the United States. During this time, Charity Barnum was not doing well. For the last 2 decades, she had been sickly and kind of a hypochondriac, but by 1873, she was diagnosed with valvular heart disease. So she was diagnosed in March of 1873, and by September, Barnum was leaving the country again. He could not be stopped. And on November 20th of that year, he got a telegram that said Charity had passed away. Barnum was in Hamburg at the time and allegedly locked himself in his room for days, but that's his version of events, because that's the way he wrote it. I don't really believe it, because rather than go home to attend to Charity's funeral, he went to London to stay with the Fishes. He didn't return to the US until April 1874. And this is because he secretly married 22-year-old Nancy in private on February 14th, 1874. Just 13 weeks after Charity's death. How charming. Nancy would bear him no children, and later in her life, Nancy would also become sickly. How interesting that Barnum had healthy wives that became very ill upon being married to him for a long time. By the time she was 40, Nancy was in a sanatorium full-time, and she became famous by giving wives' marriage advice in magazines. And let me just read to you some of the advice she wrote about. If you must be absent from him in those leisure hours in which Satan is said to provide some mischief still for idle men to do, It is not incumbent of you to provide for his solace a companion of the gentler sex, younger and fairer than yourself. And Nancy actually did eventually take her own advice. She persuaded a younger cousin of hers, named Sarah J. Fish, who was unmarried, to accompany Barnum around the world as she sat in a sanatorium. This is the book I'm referencing that I read called Phineas Taylor Barnum, but on the side of it, it says P.T. Barnum, thank you, toast, for doing whatever this is. So here's the side, P.T. Barnum, and these are the 3 authors of the book. Now, this book looks really thick because it includes a lot of pictures. A lot. There she is again. And the authors of this book have a special relationship to these photographs because their grandfather or great-grandfather was a man named Frederick Hill Meserve. Meserve was a photographer most known for his photographs of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. And at the turn of the 19th century, Meserve started to have a special interest in acquiring the Barnum negatives. Most of these negatives were taken by a man named Matthew Brady, who had his photography studio across the street from Barnum's original museum. Even though that was only for a short period of time, and Barnum, as I've discussed, lost his museum several times, Barnum still used him for all his photography needs. But the authors go into detail about how during the time that Meserve had this special interest in Barnum, photographs weren't that prized. They weren't considered very important. So Meserve knew that these Barnum negatives had to exist somewhere, but that they were probably somewhere very unremarkable. And he was right. In 1902, Meserve discovered in a New Jersey warehouse 15,000 original Matthew Brady negatives. Not only did Meserve discover this treasure trove, but he also went to great lengths to identify everyone who was in these photographs. He reached far and wide to see anyone who was still alive who was associated with Barnum when these negatives were taken. And one of the most helpful people in piecing a lot of this information together was actually Charles Stratton's widow, Lavinia Warren Stratton. Lavinia had remarried a man named Count Primo Magri, but she still remembered all of her time with Charles very fondly, and she intimately knew many people who Barnum employed. Now, this work did not stop with Meserve. His daughter actually went on to do most of the archival research. Her name was Dorothy Kuhnhart, and she went on to be a very successful children's book author. She wrote Now Open the Box, which is considered a classic, but I had never seen it or heard of it, admittedly. So one of the authors of this book, Philip B. Kuhnhart Jr., took the work that his mother and his grandfather did, and then had 2 of his own sons, Philip III and Peter. So this book spans 4 generations of family archival research. And for that reason, I think it is worth purchasing, even though it's a pretty thick book. I couldn't even remember where I acquired it or when I acquired it, but something about it was catching my eye on my bookshelf, so I decided to take a look, and it was a great read. I just finished a biography on P.T. Barnum, and I'm about to watch The Greatest Showman for the first time, which I'm sure is going to be nothing like his actual life, but I love musicals, so here we go. I already had to pause, and I'm 1 minute and 30 seconds in. This is not white enough already. It's giving Hamilton. Now I'm on Baby Barnum. Barnum was not that poor. He was by no means rich when he was young. Like, he was never hungry. In fact, he ate pretty lavishly. His father just wasn't very nice. The hole in his shoe. Oh, no. He had, like, an okay childhood. They're also calling him Phineas. He didn't go by Phineas. He went by Taylor. His grandfather was Phineas. More specifically, he went by Tale. T-A-L-E. I'm sorry, what's happening? Is his dad, like, a tailor going to a rich person's house? His dad wasn't a tailor. They owned the general store in town. And in this story, his dad is going to Charity's house because she's the rich person. Charity worked at another general store and they did not know each other as children. Like, they met around the time that they got married. Okay, his dad did die when he was like kind of young, but I think he was 16. And he was not an orphan on the street who had to steal bread. He was in his hometown that he had lived in since birth, a tiny hometown where everyone knew him. Like, if he wanted bread, he could just be like, hey, Mrs. Jones, can I have a piece of bread? And she'd be like, yeah, sure, Taylor. It's so interesting, the things that Hollywood thinks people want to see. Like, why would his real actual life not be watchable? Why are we exaggerating it like this? He does not go to work on the railroad at like 12 and then come back when he's 46. Or maybe Hugh Jackman is supposed to be like 20. I don't know. But regardless, Barnum was almost always self-employed. And this whole thing of like Charity's dad doesn't think Barnum's good enough. No, it was Barnum's mother who didn't think Charity was good enough. This was not a rich woman. This was like similar class. And Barnum actually got married to Charity in secret because his mother disapproved so much. Okay, so now we're in New York City. Is he supposed to be like an accountant for like a shipping firm? As far as I read, that never happened. He was kind of always a hustler and he made a little bit of money and he flipped a business. I think it was a bar. I think he opened a bar and flipped it, sold it in like 6 months. And his uncle had a townhouse in New York and he was like, hey, if you do that again, you can just live in my townhouse for free. So far, the only thing that's accurate is that he was a little bit of a prankster as a child. All right, so he goes to a bank to get a loan and he lies and says that he put up collateral of ships that are at the bottom of the sea. He did go to the bank and he did ask for the loan, but he put up real estate he already owned because his family gave it to him because he wasn't poor. Also, in this bank lobby, I think he just met Charles Stratton, the little person that he met when he was 4 years old, when Charles was 4 years old. He didn't meet him as a middle-aged man in a bank. I do not think Charity would be fond of the way this woman is dressed. I'll just say it like that. All right, so now he's at Charles's house. I guess Charles is 22 when they meet in this movie, and Charles's mom is embarrassed of him. Not true. It was Charles's father who was embarrassed of him. Charles's mother was fine. I see we're skipping right over Joyce Heth and all the other scams he pulled. I do appreciate that they put the line in that's like, they're already laughing at you. You might as well be paid to be laughed at. Which that kind of was how Barnum was. This scene where all the living curiosities are like being beat up on the street and like spit at by the people. Again, why does Hollywood have this like, they have to be at the bottom of the barrel type mentality to make the story interesting? These were celebrities. These were very popular people in New York City. Isn't that more interesting of a story than them being like kicked and spit at? Okay, this theater critic, Mr. Bennett, he did have a lifelong rivalry with this man. He didn't remake the ruins he and Charity used to play in as a new mansion for her. He built a giant Turkish-style mansion in the middle of Bridgeport, Connecticut called Iranistan. It was lavish, it was ridiculous, it had nothing to do with Charity. Okay, and now they're like picketing outside of his museum? If that happened, I didn't read about it. Queen Victoria did not invite Barnum to Buckingham Palace. He had to beg his way into that palace. And he did not bring his whole circus troupe, he only brought Charles. Love the casting for Miss Lind, but Barnum didn't meet her until he had already paid for her to come perform in America. He met her in New York City when she was arriving. He did take out hefty loans to cover the Jenny Lind tour, though. That's true. Okay, now you're starting to piss me off. Jenny Lind did not weirdly serenade Barnum. They were not interested in each other. Everyone in the world wanted to date Jenny Lind. Hans Christian Andersen wrote 2 stories about Jenny, and she didn't want any of them, let alone Barnum. Jenny had her lawyers on his butt, if anything. Ridiculous. The kiss on stage in front of the photographers, in front of everyone? It's the 1850s. Are you crazy? He's married. Get out of here. PT wasn't there for any of the 5 fires that his business suffered, but it's making me wonder if Zendaya's character is actually based off of Anna Swan, because Zendaya's name in this is Anne. Anna Swan was a white giantess. She was extremely tall, super smart, but when the first fire happened, Anna got trapped because she couldn't fit through any of the exits. And actually the whole circus crew like banded together to save her because they were like a found. And it seems like Zac Efron's character might be a combination of 2 dudes. One was named Edwin Forrest. He was a famous actor and he got Barnum a lot of connections. They were friends. And Barnum's son-in-law, Samuel H. Hurd, who married his daughter Helen. And Samuel H. Hurd did run back into a fire to save both Cash and several people. The scene where Charity sees the kiss on the newspaper and she like runs out and says the bank called. So Barnum did go bankrupt, but it wasn't from the fire or the Jenny Lind tour. It was from a bad real estate deal and a deal that he had with a clockmaker. And the scene where Charles Stratton comes into the bar and Barnum's all sad and broke. Charles did help Barnum when he was bankrupt. He gave Barnum money and notoriety again. The way it ends with him like quitting show business to watch his little girls grow up. That man didn't stop working until he was like in the grave and his daughters were like 40 and 50. Not to yuck anyone's yum if you enjoyed this movie, but it was nonsense. Total nonsense. Also, did they ADR the lines for Charles Stratton's actor? I don't know, it was really bizarre. To say that this is loosely based on his life is a huge exaggeration. It's so weird the tropes Hollywood insists on keeping. Now I'm going to review the Barnum musical that was made in the 80s. What is this? Wait, I'm sorry, there were like nude men in the front of this intro. What is this intro? Okay, period. Immediately, this music is more fitting for Barnum. Barnum was a corny white dude. And this is more like a ragtime style that would have been around when he was alive. Also, in the introduction, he lists off almost all of the scams I've already talked about on this playlist. So already off to a good start. Also, I think I've already seen Charity and she's like knitting in a Protestant type uniform. Already way more accurate. Oh my God, yes. So Charity's first lines in this are disapproval. Because half the time she didn't know what this man was on about. She just wanted to read her Bible and be a good Christian and go home. Okay, but in parting, they kiss, even though she's disapproving. Barnum is quoted to have said, "I've never kissed a lady and I don't plan on starting now." He was pretty puritanical about sex in general. The first song is about him being a humbug and a liar and selling lies to the public. I'm into this. Way more accurate than The Greatest Showman, which was a great musical but was hardly about P.T. Barnum. They're even accurate to the name that Barnum went by. Actually calls him Tail, or Taylor. Oh God. Joyce Heth is in this musical. I don't really know how I feel about her being like in on jokes. She was a total victim in this scenario. I mean, he purchased her for God's sake. So Joyce has a musical number and Honestly, it's a banger. I don't know how to feel about her representation in this, and I don't think I'm the best person to comment on it. It is true that Joyce went along with Barnum's lie, but did she have a choice? Like, on one hand, I'm glad that Joyce is mentioned. On the other hand, again, I just don't think I'm the right person to be, like, dissecting this. I feel weird about it. That's where I'll end it. I'm watching the 1986 version on YouTube, and the woman who plays Joyce can sing, though, I'll tell you that. Okay, now they're kind of framing it like Chariot was on his butt 24/7, and that she was the beast he really needed to train. Give me a break. This man did whatever he wanted 365 days of the year. They're kind of making it seem like Charity was in on making the museum good. I don't think she cared. I don't even know if she believed in him. The book doesn't really go into that, so I can't comment too much, but I don't think this happened. It's also accurate that Barnum was highly critical of Charity for the first, like, 10 to 12 years of their marriage. And then at the 14-year mark, he started to be like, dang, she's really held me down. She's had some good ideas and she's been right about a lot. I got pretty emotional when the first museum burns down in this musical, just because I know the gravity of what was lost as far as live animals. This is probably the first major disparity, though. Charity didn't come up with the idea for a circus accidentally, and Barnum did not go into the circus business when the first fire happened. He immediately built a second museum. All right, so Charles Stratton is also in this musical, and Barnum does meet him when he was a child. However, Charles's dad is the one who seeks Barnum out in this musical. That did not happen. Barnum absolutely sought out Charles Stratton. Why is adult Charles Stratton not played by a little person? They made the guards at Buckingham Palace perform on stilts to make General Tom Thumb seem like a little person. What if you just hired a little person? What? In this musical, Jumbo comes to Buckingham Palace with Charles Stratton. Huh? Okay, so Charity is involved in, like, a suffrage group. I did not read about this in the book, so I don't know if that's true or not. But I will say Barnum took part in many intellectual clubs during his day, all of which women were a part of. So he did surround himself with smart women and was not threatened by them and listened to them. But in this musical, the tour to England was Charity's idea. That's definitely not true. And Barnum absolutely did not leave her in charge of the tour, whatever that means, while he was gone. While he was away from New York, Barnum let a hometown friend of his named Fordyce Hitchcock run his affairs. Hitchcock was prone to mental breakdowns, so eventually he was replaced. Interesting. So in this musical, Jenny Lind can't speak English, and again, I don't know if that's true or not. They didn't mention it in the book I read. I thought she spoke English. There was never a language barrier mentioned. Oh, brother, this musical does it too. Jenny Lind was not interested in Barnum. It's the exact opposite. When Jenny was 31, she married a 21-year-old. So when she first came to America, Barnum was 10 years older than her, and she ended up marrying someone who was 10 years younger than her. Oh, give me a break. Now there's a musical number about how he's being so limited by Charity and he's just a man. Man, get out of here. Now Jenny Lind is confronting him because he's writing too many letters to his own wife that she already knew existed. This never happened. Wait a minute. Okay, so Barnum goes bankrupt from doing business with a clock company. In this musical, Charity is the one who made him work at the clock company. That never happened. He just did business with them. He didn't work there. And this business deal made him go bankrupt. Why would this musical blame Charity for this? She didn't have anything to do with his business dealings. Again, he was uncontrollable. They also make it seem like Charity was the one guiding his campaign for various government positions, and that her ideas were so boring that he needed to bring the color back into his campaign. Charity was boring compared to him, but she also had many more morals, and she had nothing to do with his government campaigns. As far as I read, at least. Alright, so we've gotten to Charity's death, and Barnum is heartbroken. When in reality, Barnum didn't even leave England when his wife died. And in secret, 13 weeks later, he would marry a Nancy Fish, who he had been emotionally cheating on Charity with for years already. All right, I finally finished. Overall, I think this musical is a more accurate portrayal of the timeline of Barnum's life. I do still think it's fairly inaccurate, especially the portrayal of Charity and Jenny Lind, and Joyce Heth and Charles Stratton, I guess. But at least these things are kind of mentioned in this musical, whereas The Greatest Showman is just like, why did they even attach P.T. Barnum's name to this? I'll also say that The Greatest Showman was very obviously written to be a film, and Barnum the musical was very obviously written for the stage. They're super different and not easy to compare. And if I'm putting accuracy aside, I think I liked Greatest Showman better. Not gonna lie.